The holidays are here, and the Home Depot has everything you need to stay connected with smart home upgrades. Whether you're keeping an eye out for the big guy or keeping an eye on your family, the Home Depot has you covered with great tech, like the Ring Indoor Camera 2-pack with advanced motion detection, two-way talk, and color night vision. Plus, get your smart home devices the smart way with free delivery. Get holiday ready with seasonal savings happening now at the Home Depot. Subject to availability, see homedepot.com/delivery for details.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and I am very pleased today to welcome back Tony Riches to the show. Hi, Tony.
Hi. Thank you for having me.
I am really excited to have this chat with you. You and I have never done a video interview together before, and I am very much looking forward to talking to you about all of your books, actually, but in particular, today we're going to be talking about your new book. So before we get into that, why don't you give the listeners a little bit of background on you?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, it goes back to when I was born, actually, because I was born in Pembroke, in Pembrokeshire, quite close to the castle where Henry VII was born. And I decided I'd like to learn a bit more about him. So I started researching his life and found at the time there were no novels about him which were factually correct based on good historical research. So I started gathering together material and I ended up with enough for 3 books. So that's what I wrote, was 3 books. I wrote the Tudor trilogy, which begins with his birth in Pembroke Castle and then his time in exile with Jasper Tudor. And I actually followed in his footsteps all the way to remote Brittany with my wife, to all the places that he stayed. So it was real authentic research. And then the 3rd book starts with the Battle of Bosworth and follows it through to his death. And I'm pleased to say that it was a huge success because I was the first one, believe it or not, to actually do that. And 1 month I sold over 10,000 books in the 1 month.
Oh, wow.
Which was more than I could ever have dreamed of. And when it finished, I wasn't sure what to do next because I was going to move on. And I thought, do you know what I'm going to do is follow the story of the Tudors all the way to the end of Elizabeth's reign. And so to bridge from Henry VII to Elizabeth, I obviously had to deal with that rascal Henry VIII. And I decided a nice way of doing it would be to tell the story through his youngest sister's eyes and his best friend's eyes. And so in the end of the 3rd book of the Tudor trilogy, his sister, Mary Tudor, this is Mary Tudor, Queen of France, to save any confusion. She's nursing him on his deathbed. And so the 1st book of the next trilogy picks up with Mary's story, which of course is fascinating because Henry VIII marries her off to the rather decrepit King of France. And it raises all sorts of questions, doesn't it? What did she think of that? And is it true that she just sort of accepted it and saw it as her duty? It seems a bit strange, but of course, people know that she ended up marrying Henry's best friend, Charles Brandon, at great personal risk. And, Henry VIII could have been furious. He's not somebody you really want to be upsetting, is he, with something like that?
No.
But, so to round off what became the Brandon trilogy, of course, after Mary's days, Charles Brandon married his 14-year-old ward, Catherine Willoughby, who just by chance happened to be a wealthy heiress and owned most of Lincolnshire. And so her story was absolutely intriguing because Catherine Willoughby, as she was, not only did she marry Charles Brandon, but she knew every one of Henry VIII's wives because her mother was Maria Salinas, who was Catherine of Aragon's lady in waiting. And then one by one, she sort of worked her way through all the different wives, and they would visit her house. And so I was able to weave all of that story in, and his children, because her children were educated with his children. And then we see the end of Henry's reign, and then everything that happens then, right through to the start of the Elizabethan era. And I actually visited Catherine Willoughby's house, Grimsthorpe Castle in Lincolnshire, and I stood in the very room where she died. And then we went to the church not far away in Spilsby, where her tomb is, and I was able to lay my hand actually on her tomb. The vicar of the church, I'd arranged to meet him there, but he'd misunderstood and given us the whole church to ourselves.
Oh, wow.
So we were like alone in the Willoughby Chapel with Catherine Willoughby, which was a very special moment, really, because I felt I'd been spending every day with her, you could say, for the previous 2 years, a year of research and a year of writing. And when it came to the Elizabethan series, I started off by thinking that for once I would actually do it through Elizabeth's eyes. But then she's such a complex person that I found that quite challenging. So I decided that I would show her through the eyes of three of her favorite men, which I chose. It was fairly easy to choose because I chose Drake, Essex, and Raleigh, each of whom saw her completely differently, because Drake worshipped her. You could say he idolized her because he was that sort of person. He used to bring her chests of jewels and try and impress her with everything he did. Essex was the son that she never had and was really quite rude to her most of the times, bursting into her bedchamber when she was in a state of undress and things like that, and even beating her at cards, which nobody did. And then Raleigh was quite different again, because he was the captain of her guard. And once again, he was a commoner, but he had a particular point of view of Elizabeth, and quite a chip. Well, they all had chips on their shoulders, really, I suppose. But I thought it'd be fun to then make it, instead of a trilogy, a 6-book series, and then take 3 of her ladies and continue this sort of multi-dimensional look at Queen Elizabeth I through the eyes of 3 of her ladies, who all saw her very differently. And the 3 that I chose were all, once again, quite different and very intriguing, because I knew so little about them. I thought I knew all about the men. It turned out that most of what I knew was actually wrong. What I was taught at school about Drake and Essex and Raleigh turned out to not be backed up by actual fact, really. But I'd never heard of this lady, Penelope Rich, who turned out to be such a fascinating character and witnessed all the key events of Elizabeth's reign, and was such a modern woman, because she didn't care at all what people thought. She had a husband that she abandoned, really, and then had her lovers and things like that, and had her own way of looking at the world, really, I suppose, quite a modern way. And then the next one I took on, which I want to talk about today, really, is the daughter of the Queen's Spymaster, Frances Walsingham. Now, we know quite a lot about Francis Walsingham, but I knew virtually, I didn't even know he had a daughter, I think, when I started. No, actually, she was a good friend of Penelope. So that's where I came across her and started learning that not only was she his daughter, she was his only surviving child. And she nursed him through dreadful illness in his later days at Walsingham House, which was in the shadow of the Tower of London. And I decided it was perfectly feasible that he would have shared state secrets with her, and that she was educated better than most men. So, and he was one of the few people that he could trust, would be his own daughter. He could trust her implicitly. So in the end, she ends up decoding secret letters and encoding things for him like a secretary, really. But it means that once again, she's party to information that most people in the world don't know about, like all the ins and outs of what happened with Mary, Queen of Scots and the Spanish Armada. And there's various things like that I'm able to explore. And then the last one, which I'm writing now, it came to me when I was writing Raleigh that he was pretty awful to his wife and took her completely for granted. And Elizabeth, or Bess Raleigh, was one of these women that was only educated with what she would need to run a household. So when you read her letters, they're written phonetically with lots of apologies for being so uneducated and things like that. And I felt so sorry for her because at first I felt sorry for her. And then I realized that there was a turning point in her life when she found out that Walter had had a child by a woman in Ireland. And she kind of decided to take charge of her life and to get educated and to run the household without consulting her husband and do things like that. And I'm about halfway through that book now, and I'm really enjoying it because whereas in the book about Raleigh, everything is from his point of view and he's really quite heroic. From Bess's point of view, he really is not that heroic. She spends most of her time trying to persuade him not to sail off to Guyana and look for the lost city of gold and things like that. And in the research for it all, my wife and I visited Sherborne, which is their house in Dorset. And when we got there, and we were shown around by the owner, who's Lady Denby, and she actually allowed us to go up into Walter Raleigh's study, which is not generally open to the public. I don't know if you've been there at Sherborne. It's fascinating. And I was able to stand in the window of Walter Raleigh's study and look down into the deer park, exactly on the spot where he would have stood thinking about his next voyage. And so it's when I'm writing about it, it's totally authentic because I've really had the chance to think about how it might have felt and how it looked. So that takes me through the entire stories of the Tudors, because I started off with Owen Tudor's first meeting with Queen Catherine of Valois, and then I end up with various people's accounts of Queen Elizabeth I on her deathbed and how they react to it and what it means for them all. So I think it's one of the few attempts to do that over quite such a large canvas, really, over quite such a number of books, because I have to think how many there are. There's 12 books in total. So it's interesting. I had a message the other day from a reader, and she said she started reading Owen while she was bedridden while she was expecting her son. So she thought she'd read the Tudor trilogy, and she was inspired to name her son Owen, which is a nice little touch, isn't it?
Well, isn't that nice?
There's all these ripples in the pond, but I'd like to think that in some modest way, I've introduced a lot of people to the real stories of the Tudors in the context of their life and times, rather than the sort of Hollywood version where they waving chicken leg around and what have you, trying to show what it must have been like to live through a time when half the population could be wiped out by the sweating sickness or the plague going through London and, wiping out entire streets of people. So I was able to draw a little bit on our own experience of COVID, because a lot of the things we did during COVID were exactly what they did during the plague in London. So there's those little touches which make it, I hope, a sense of authenticity.
Yeah, definitely. I have to say, you mentioned your book, Owen, and I think that's the first book of yours that I read as well. And to this day, no offense to any of your other books, that one is by far my favorite.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah.
You really brought to life a character from history, and not only a character, obviously a real person from history, in a way that I don't think I had ever experienced before. We had heard the name Owen Tudor, but really didn't know very much about him. And your book just brought him to life. So I can't thank you enough for writing his
Oh,
story.
thank you. Yeah, well, I can tell you a secret about that book, is I'd written, when I started off, there were no letters from Owen Tudor and no contemporaneous accounts really, apart from towards the end of the book. And as I move forward through time, there's a wealth of material. So, for example, with Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, I had 2 volumes of his letters and papers to draw upon. And even the ones that had been written in French or whatever, or Latin, had all been transcribed into English for me. So I was spoiled, really. I had to decide what to leave out, not what to include. But with Owen, I had to be a lot more creative, because all I had was where he was at any particular point in time. We did go to Windsor Castle and try and explore it, but of course it's changed so much since his time, you could only get the faintest sense of it. But I'd written 3 chapters, and I read Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, and I couldn't work out what it was about it that really gripped me, but I saw her speaking about writing it, and she talked about writing in the first person present tense instead of the past tense. And so I was so impressed by that I actually went back and I rewrote right from chapter 1 in present tense. And in fact, I'm writing Bess now in present tense, which I've got quite used to doing. But most people don't even notice, by the way, I think, if you ask them, what tense was that book in that you read? They say, I don't know. But it creates, it's the distance between the reader and the events is reduced, because it's got that sense of immediacy, which I think is quite intriguing, because that's thanks to the late Hilary Mantel.
Yeah, I prefer first person, but I know it's at least what I've heard is it's much more difficult to write in first person rather third person.
Yeah, I think particularly with when a man is writing about a woman, that is particularly challenging. So with Bess, I'm writing in the third person present tense, but I'm trying to not have too much of a gap between the reader and the events. So that's quite interesting to do. It's a kind of intellectual exercise.
Yeah.
But I've got quite used to it, and I've had plenty of practice.
Well, you're a brilliant writer, and I can't help but notice, and I have to bring this up because you just skipped right past Edward VI and Mary I in your series on the Tudors. What made you decide to do that?
They are in there because Catherine Willoughby's sons were educated with Edward I. So Catherine has various conversations with him, and there's, I don't skip it really. And then Mary, of course, Catherine was a devout Protestant, and when Mary took the throne, their lives were at risk. And one of Catherine's close associates was a rather tragic lady called Anne Askew that you'll know about. And Anne could have so easily given the name of Catherine Brandon, as it was then, to, of all people, Richard Rich, who is the father of Robert Rich, who married Penelope. That's why she's Penelope Rich. So isn't that an interesting, complicated connection? But Catherine has to escape to the continent with her husband. And I really enjoyed following in her footsteps across the countryside in the snow, with her little son was born there. Peregrine was born while she was in exile. And it really must have been like the end of the world for her. But that's how I covered Mary, was as an existential threat to my characters, because that's what she was, you see. But there's some really interesting things, like Catherine's really good friend was William Cecil, and they were all very close to Queen Catherine Parr, you see. And in Lamentation of a Sinner, if you look at the frontispiece, the dedication page, it's dedicated to William Cecil and Catherine Willoughby. So that shows evidence of the nature of their relationship and the closeness of it that is undeniable. I mean, she would have given a lot of thought to that before she put that in there.
Oh, most definitely. I am always the first to admit that the Elizabethan period is not my strong point. I really kind of stop researching the Tudors after Thomas Seymour's execution in 1549. That's kind of my stop point. But I am fascinated by the reign of Elizabeth I, and I love that you touch on these women from the period. And I want to talk about Frances Walsingham, the daughter. Her father actually is somebody I don't know very much about either, other than he was known as Elizabeth's Spymaster, and I love the fact that it seems like his daughter is named after him.
Yes.
What does that say about the man?
It was quite a typical thing that they did in those days. It's very confusing sometimes, because Robert Devereux's got a son called Robert Devereux, and you find that all over the place, really, that you can end up with a conversation between two people with the same name, and you have to, as an author, you have to really work hard to make sure that it's obvious who's speaking, even.
Yeah.
But no, it's quite fun, because it adds another dimension to it, doesn't it? Then
it does. It does. And her story is interesting too, because you bring in so many of these other families of the period that you've already talked about. And we talk about her first marriage. Let's start there, because I think she was probably average age at the time, right?
Spoiler alert for those who haven't had a chance to read the book yet. I'm pleased to say the book is doing extremely well, by the way. Since it was published, it's been my best-selling book, I think, every single day. Which is quite something. But she was married 3 times, and the first time was arranged by her father to this chap, Philip Sidney, who was an amazing character, because he was the last of the true sort of warrior poet knights. So he could beat anybody at a joust, but then he could dash off a really quite good poem. And, it seemed like there was nothing much he couldn't do. He was a charismatic leader of men as well, so they used to follow him into battle without question. And poor Frances, unfortunately for her, she was best friends with Penelope Rich and knew that Philip Sidney was Penelope Rich's secret lover, brackets not so secret, and so that's not a great start to a marriage, is it?
No.
But they made a go of it, and I think it's amazing. The amazing thing that she did was she followed him to the Battle of Zutphen in the Netherlands, which is quite unusual. I think normally the wives would stay at home and rear the children and things like that. But she followed him there, and obviously her father wasn't too impressed with that as an idea, but quite brave of her, really, because it's quite a dangerous thing to do. And so I was able to explore that particular time through her eyes. And I think it's important, because to understand these Elizabethan women, if you understand what they've been through and why they did it, then you can start to understand why they acted as they did and how they felt about things. And after that, I have to laugh, because I can't think of a worse person for her to marry, was the Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, because not the ideal husband, and he was a rascal, really. I quite enjoyed writing his story, but there's a theory which I've read, which is that he promised Philip Sidney on his deathbed that he would take care of his wife and daughter. Her little daughter was called Elizabeth, by the way, and it suited him. She wasn't an heiress, but she was very bright and extremely well connected, and her father was the Queen's Spymaster, so there was a few things going for it. And it's typical of him that he married her and then took her completely for granted. So she went from one marriage which was flawed for one set of reasons to another marriage which was flawed for a completely different set of reasons. And in both cases, the common denominator was Penelope, because Penelope is Robert Devereux's sister. So that's a small world, isn't it? So they all end up in Essex House. So she's sister-in-law to Penelope Rich. So what I was able to do was to explore the same big events in Elizabethan times from yet another point of view, very different point of view, because Penelope's point of view was almost as a bystander, and then Frances was party to all of her father's knowledge, you see. So, and there's the character that runs like a thread through it all is Robert Cecil, William Cecil's son, who's a fascinating character because, like we can now say, like Richard III, he suffered from scoliosis and had a deformed back, which meant that he was lucky, really, to do as well as he did. And he became the power behind the throne after his father died, and of course carried on to see King James on the throne. It was Robert Cecil that really sort of managed the transition, in my view anyway, throughout the end of the Tudors to the start of the Stuarts. And all these people in different ways were either friends with him or enemies with him. So I like the way that ripples through the whole of the Elizabethan series. And Bess, that I'm writing about now, even though she could barely write, used to regularly correspond with Robert Cecil, who's one of the most powerful men in the land. So I found that intriguing as well. Much to Walter Raleigh's amazement, he would say things like, "How do you know that? Where did you find that out from?" And of course, it's from Robert Cecil, who knows everything, what's going on at court and what have you. Not gossip, but deep political intrigue behind the scenes. Just to round off the marriages, I'm pleased to say, and I was really pleased from a writing point of view, that Frances, against the odds, finds somebody that she falls in love with, who's available. So he's just suddenly appears from nowhere. He turns out to have been her husband's no, not her husband's. It's Penelope Rich's new lover's right-hand man. Isn't that complicated? Charles Blount, who the Lord Mountjoy he was, who took over from Essex in Ireland, in the battles in Ireland. And they fall in love, but Francis is a Protestant and this new chap is a Catholic. So that's an interesting thing. And she thinks he's just a soldier, and then she finds out that he's actually the Earl of Clanricarde and owns great swathes of countryside in Ireland. So most historians, when they're writing, if they do bother to write about Francis, they kind of lose interest after the Earl of Essex ends his days in the Tower of London. And that's halfway through my book. I carry on and go to Ireland with Frances and explore what it must have been like for her to see both sides, because her husband was an Irish lord, but he was also the sort of president of the area, so that he was representing Elizabeth I as well. So that's quite interesting and complicated. And they had more children there as well. So I was able to explore that. And she even learns a bit of the Irish language and starts to help the people there. And then ends up back in England eventually. So there's a nice sort of rounding off to that story that with her 3 marriages, she was a countess twice, because she was Countess of Essex and then she was Countess of Clanricarde. And she had a fortune in the end. She was really quite wealthy towards the end. And they built a house from the ground up, which was everything they wanted, sort of thing, you know. And that still exists. That's a private school now in Kent, which is quite interesting.
Oh, wow. See, now I was down in the Kent area when I was there in June and probably didn't even know it. I find it absolutely fascinating when you were talking about Penelope Rich and the Earl of Essex, and we bring Francis into this and Philip Sidney, all the connections to Robert, Earl of Leicester, right? Like he seems to be looming in the background of all of these stories.
Yeah. And of course, I never know whether to call her Lettice or Lettice. Some of the people.
Yes, the debate.
But she was the Queen's nemesis. And of course, she was their mother. So no wonder Robert Devereux ended up like he did, because imagine having her for a mother. That must have been quite interesting. She was an awful mother, by the way, and left him much to his own devices. And as soon as she could, she packed him off to be brought up by William Cecil, who did that as a sort of sideline. He used to take on future earls and then make sure they were properly educated and went to either Oxford or Cambridge. So all of that was really quite interesting as well.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Francis now, since this is the topic of your book. And, you know, you had mentioned that she kind of worked alongside her father. What can you tell us about that time and what did she learn?
Well, I actually managed to find there's quite a lot of it exists about the actual codes that they used. And there are actual transcriptions of codes and there's coded letters and things like that. So, of course, we've got a couple of big events, which is the Spanish Armada and the downfall of Mary, Queen of Scots, both of which Francis Walsingham, her father, was intimately involved with trying to make sure events turned out as they did. Of course, with the Spanish Armada, it was the weather as much as anything else which determined the outcome of that. But he did actually make sure that they had as much intelligence as possible. So he had spies in every Spanish port feeding back intelligence. And then in my view of things, who is he going to share that with? Because who can he trust? You can't, Robert Cecil had his own spies as well that were almost competing for information. And so his daughter, as I said, was an obvious person that could help him and he could discuss things with. And so that was quite interesting to do. But the other thing that I found is you might have seen it, but there's a thing called Folgopedia, which is the Elizabethan court day by day. If you just Google the Elizabethan court day by day, you can actually pick any year and then you can see a very detailed account of every single event that happened in that year in the Elizabethan court, backed up by letters and papers, and then it cross-links to the Cecil papers, which is a similar sort of site. So any year, I had the luxury of being able to find out who gave what gifts to the Queen, what she thought of it, where she was on her progress, who was with her. Such a wealth of information. And of course, what I was always interested in was teasing out how would this relate to Frances, the daughter of Francis Walsingham, and how would it affect her world and her life, and what would she think of it? So that was always my direction. And as usual, they normally end up getting banished by Elizabeth I. I think all three of them got banished at some point or other. It was the easy way to deal with troublesome ladies in waiting. We'll just banish them, and it means they've got a slightly arm's length view of what's going on, and some of them, that means that they misunderstand what's going on, but others that they understand better than the people that are actually at court. So I found that quite interesting as well. But as a reader, what you get is a multi-dimensional view of Queen Elizabeth, because it is from so many different points of view. It's from 6 points of view at least, but there are other characters in there that have a view about things, like Robert Dudley, for example, who ends up as Penelope's stepfather. So that's a complicated thing, isn't it? And
yeah, I appreciate how important it is to you when writing your stories to understand the daily life. And when you were talking about this website where it has the day-by-day stuff in there, I found that really fascinating, because I think even as a historian, it's so important to be able to understand the period as a whole. You can't just research a person and go, well, these are the things that they did. You have to understand what was it like to live during that time. And I'm curious, did you find anything while going through this day by day that you found fascinating, or something you'd never heard of?
I hadn't really appreciated how much the courtiers would do. It's a bit like in the UK, you've got members of parliament that represent their constituents, and similar in America, that there's senators and what. So if there's a disaster in Florida or something like that, then there's various things that kick in. And it was the same in England at the time, that really quite a lowly person who had had a burglary or something, or was in court. I was amazed that at the level of involvement of quite senior courtiers, like Francis Walsingham and Robert Cecil and William Cecil, would personally get involved. And people like Francis would write letters on their behalf, pleading for them to be recompensed or whatever. And I had no idea of all of that, because like most people, I suppose, when I was taught history at school, we just covered the key events and moved on, really. So, we did quite a good grounding on the Spanish Armada, but I didn't get a terribly good sense of what it must have been like to have been one of the commanders of the army on our side. Robert Dudley died of the flux waiting for an army to land that never landed, and in Francis's case, she's worried all the time about, are the Spanish going to come swarming up the River Thames and ransack London? It's a very real threat. And there's parallels with the world around us now. So I could relate, try and make it relatable and relate to it as well. And Elizabeth I, I had no idea that she was so superstitious. Nobody had ever told me she was superstitious. But in the Elizabethan court day by day, it says she was in a panic because so many fleas had gathered at the windows of her palace that she took that as a bad omen. And so they quickly they used to move on what they called a progress all the time. They would constantly move, and they'd be followed by an army of fumigators and cleaners that would put everything back to right again. But apparently a school of porpoises, like small dolphins, came up the River Thames, and it was brought to the Queen's attention, and she saw that as a sign that the Armada was on its way, even though she had really good information from Francis Walsingham and others about the Armada was actually going up the English Channel, not up the River Thames. And the superstitious side of her character was overruling the sort of logical, rational side of her thinking, which then affected their government policy, So that was quite intriguing, I thought.
Yeah, that is very intriguing. I really have to check out this day by day thing because it sounds absolutely fascinating. I'll probably include a link to it in the show notes as
That's a good
well.
idea. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about Frances's relationship with Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, and understand what she thought of him and how did she handle his relationship with Elizabeth and then his arrest and downfall.
It started quite well because she was lonely and sad, and her life was quite dull because her father died, of course, eventually. So she was alone in Walsingham House, and then Robert Devereux comes knocking on the door to give her his condolences, and they've got quite a lot in common. She finds because his sister is her friend, and Penelope, that is. And of course, he actually fought alongside Philip at the Battle of Zutphen, and was there when Philip died. So, they've got all of that in common. So they start off, they're not much different in age. He's quite a handsome character, larger than life sort of person with a big sort of ginger hair and everything, which he claims is part of his Tudor inheritance through his mother, by the way. That's an interesting rabbit hole to go down, because that's Mary Boleyn, then, you see. That goes all the way back to Mary Boleyn. And it's interesting as to if they'd have had DNA testing in those days, they could have settled that argument for us, couldn't they?
Yeah.
But pretty soon, of course, Frances realizes that not only does he have a mistress at court, which is one of the reasons that he seems to be away so much at court, but he's got more than one. And so basically, he literally was taken her completely for granted. And as with most women at the time, they end up having nearly a child a year. So that was quite a challenge for me as a writer, because every chapter there's another baby nearly. And I wanted to try and explore the different sort of thinking about childbirth and rearing children and things like that, because that's an important part of her story. And her legacy was her children, really, I think, largely. But it was quite a challenge. So I've got two children, and I was present at their birth. So I'd seen, it doesn't have to be an awful lot of screaming necessarily. And my wife is my beta reader. So she's actually reading Bess as I write each chapter. She's the first person to read it. So she can tell me then whether it seems authentic or not. This is one of the things I said is, as a man writing about a man, that's quite easy, really, in one regard, in terms of relatability. But writing about an Elizabethan woman is a completely different ballgame. So what it felt like to wear those constraining clothes, I've had to study that and learn as much as I can about the sort of mechanics of the way they used to dress. So every now and then I put in a little reminder about that, where they're doing up bodices so tight they can hardly breathe, or they're doing it to hide evidence of a pregnancy that they don't want people to know about, or whatever, But it must have been awful, wasn't it? And that's all part of the sort of the backstory to really what is quite a nice rounded story, in that having been forced into a marriage and stumbled into another one, to actually meet somebody that she really cares about and cares about her, a sensitive man who doesn't take her for granted at all, because he didn't think he'd be able to marry her, you see, because being a Catholic. And she, as a Protestant, she's been brought up a Protestant all of her life. she's hardly going to change her religion
Right.
just to get married, would she? I mean, who would do that? So I quite enjoyed playing around with all of that, and it's almost of the books. I think the one I've just written, Francis, is the one which is the covers the greatest amount of ground in terms of personal development of the main lead character.
Did you get a feel for what type of mother she was?
Absolutely, because whereas with the others, it's all about being on ships at sea or on battles and things like that. With her, it's all about her children, and so with two children of my own, I can easily think back to how they were at a certain age, and so that's quite fun. She would, because she was so well educated, she could actually be their tutor and teach them Latin and French and Spanish and even a bit of Portuguese, which most mothers would not be able to do. But also she was able to teach them about spycraft if she wanted to, and she could teach them about etiquette at court and things like that. So I enjoyed all of that, and I think the answer is yes. She was off the scale in terms of her ability as a mother to give her children an appropriate set of values.
That's wonderful. Well, Tony, I'm curious, out of all the research that you've done on Frances, and maybe you've already mentioned this, but what would you say was the most interesting thing you discovered about her?
The holidays are here, and the Home Depot has everything you need to stay connected with smart home upgrades. Whether you're keeping an eye out for the big guy or keeping an eye on your family, the Home Depot has you covered with great tech, like the Ring Indoor Camera 2-pack with advanced motion detection, two-way talk, and color night vision. Plus, get your smart home devices the smart way with free delivery. Get holiday ready with seasonal savings happening now at the Home Depot. Subject to availability, see homedepot.com/delivery for details.
That's an interesting question. I think it's how she dealt with her time in Ireland, because she knew nothing about Ireland other than from what she'd read and what her father had told her. She'd never been to Ireland. And it was this kind of mythical place where people disappeared off to and sometimes never came back. And that for her to make the move which she didn't have to do, by the way, and she went to Athlone Castle, which was a bleak military fortress. So she didn't start off in a palace, and she actually did this, so it's authentic, and I've got it documented in letters and papers that she actually was there. And of course, she had to travel very close to where I am now, through Wales to Fishguard to get a boat across to Dublin, which I've done as well. And so I found that the most interesting side of her, because through her eyes, I could explore the consequences of the famine in Ireland and the whole thing about the where land was being given away to the Scots, which is a precursor for King James's taking over, and how different people felt about that, and how she was kind of able to see it from both sides was intriguing.
It really does make a huge difference to be able to experience these places that the people you write about have been. Like when you mentioned Walter Raleigh standing at the window looking over the deer park, I don't think I've fully grasped how important it is to experience these places until I had been there myself and went, oh, okay. And there is something to be said for being on the same land, even as a historical figure had been, to really get a perspective on what their life was like and the things that they saw. And it's one of my favorite things to do is stare through an old castle window and imagine I'm not the first person who has looked through this window. I love it.
There's still some things I'd like to do. I'd like to see. I haven't been to Hever Castle yet. I got close, but I haven't actually been. I want to see Anne Boleyn's prayer book because
Okay.
I've seen it online so many times, and there's things like that. So I've still got a lot that I want to do with the Tudors. And when I told you that I followed in the footsteps of the Tudors on exile in Brittany, one of the most amazing things that we did was we managed to track down the chateau in the forest that Henry VII spent quite a lot of time in. And you could just about climb up inside his tower. There was signs in French saying danger, falling rocks and things. And I knew that not many people do that, because when we got up to the top, we were actually standing in his room, and because there's a guidebook that confirms that we were in the right place. And my wife said to me, "Oh, you got cobwebs all over your back," because nobody had been up there for so long. The spider's webs had just blocked off the spiral staircase, and I'd been oblivious to that. I just wanted to get up there and see it. It was quite dangerous, and I wouldn't be surprised if they stopped people going up there now. But that experience really brought it home to me as to what it must have been like, and that inspired me then to go the extra mile with later books to actually visit real locations and get a sense of them.
I appreciate the amount of research you put into your work. I think it makes all of your novels stand head and shoulders above other people's work, because you are walking in the footsteps. You are looking at the primary sources and giving it that real, true perspective. So thank you for all of the work that you do in writing your books.
I enjoy it. I must admit, I started doing this full time in 2011, and I've written a book a year ever since. And I got a great system, because I research when the weather's nice in the summer, and then I write it from now on through the winter, and then it goes to my editor really as early as I can, but sometime around February, March, and then it's published in the spring quite often. So, I mean, they vary when they get published, because it depends how long. I've got the same editor that's done all the books, so she's able to look across them all for consistency. And she's a professional editor, and is able to understand my style, so that she's extremely helpful then. So it's turned into a bit of a team effort, because I've got the same audiobook narrator, Ruth Redman, who's an actress who narrates the audiobooks, and she also understands the complex sort of crossing over the different storylines. So the audiobooks are doing well, and I find it amazing to actually hear my characters speak. The first time you hear sort of Catherine Willoughby speaking, I think, did I write that? It's amazing to do. The most recent one I've had done is the audiobook of Essex, and that one has got actual sound effects on it as well. So that's unusual. Doors creak and bells ring and cannons actually go bang and things like that, which adds another dimension again to it. So I think that's the future of audiobooks.
I think that's absolutely brilliant. As someone who has tried to do editing like that with sound effects, I can appreciate how much work goes into adding all of those sound effects into a story. It's a lot, but it does really add something. It immerses you into the story for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Well, Tony, if anybody wants to get a hand on any of your books, not just your Francis one, where can they find them?
At the moment, they're all exclusive to Amazon. And so if you just type in Tony Riches into Amazon, you'll see all of my books, which is good. And I've also got a website, tonyriches.com, which has got everything on there, including links to all the audiobooks and things like that. And I've got a blog, which is linked to from my website, where I talk about my research. And I've done a series of podcasts as well, which I'm quite pleased that, I I didn't think anybody much would listen to them, but they've been downloaded more than 250,000 times. And of course, most people don't even need to download them. But that's where I'm talking about my research in more detail. And that's called Stories of the Tudors. But really, I think the best thing is just go onto Amazon and you can link to everything from there.
I'll include links to that in the show notes as well. And then I want to end here, Tony, thanking you for being such a champion to people in the Tudor world like myself. I think you are such a wonderful collaborator, and you are the first to work with us and share our work as well. And I don't know that the Tudor community appreciates you as much as you should be appreciated, because you've really done a lot for us. And when I joined the scene back in 2015, you were one of the first people to reach out to me and to welcome me to the community. And that has always meant a lot to me. So thank you.
Well, I'm really impressed with what you've done since.
I've done a couple things, huh?
Covered a lot of ground, yeah.
Back then, I think that when you first met me, I think that's when I just had a Paperly account right before I started my blog. And I think, yeah, you have followed along on this wild journey that I've been on, and it's been fun to see all the work that you've done too. So congratulations to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. And thank you for inviting me to speak today, because it's been fun.
Yes, it has. Thank you, Tony. Well, that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, please consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. As a patron, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, some patron-exclusive content, and even discounts on upcoming webinars and lectures. Head on over to Patreon today to find out more information. And for as little as $3 a month, you can show your support. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.